Of course, darling, I command you, no one can against me. Never you. Of course, darling, you. Of course, darling, that is what she can have. That no one can against us. That we have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what she can have. That world is yours, but you have to find the capital letters and let them. Of course, darling, that is what she can have. Of course, darling, it's capital important that you let them. Of course, darling, that is what she can have, that we don't have to go back in time. Of course, darling, that is what she can have, that you have to forget about everything. Of course, darling, that is what she can have, that we had enough. Of course, darling, we're on a guy's side, so don't neglect. Of course, we want to flex now. Of course, darling, I don't know. Do what you want, but between the capital letters and the black snow from the guy's side, well, you don't have to neglect. I don't know, I think you're doing things bad. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, we're on a guy's side and you shouldn't neglect. Of course, darling, but okay, if you wanna do flex now, just do it. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us. Of course, darling, I don't wanna be saved, I don't want none of your kids. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna blow myself. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna blow myself, I'm gonna drink the whole wine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna kiss the bottle, that I'm gonna be so drunk. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm gonna kiss the bottle. Of course, darling, I'm gonna blow myself and give a kiss, or give me a kiss and blow myself. Of course, darling, both ways. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that there are want to make a weathering wine. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I know how to drive a car. Of course, darling, I'm missing you, see my heart without you. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I know how to drive a car. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I go far away from everyone. Of course, darling, Veronica is and you shouldn't neglect. Of course, darling, but if you wanna do black snow, what's your problem? Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us. But come on, of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that we're you. Of course, darling, you should find the capital letters from world is yours and letter. Of course, darling, you're drowning your life. Of course, darling, but if you want to do that, just drown your life. Of course, darling, I give it them. Of course, darling, I don't wanna be saved. Of course, and you shouldn't save no one, because you're gonna sing on if you have something of your own in the room. Of course, darling, I kiss them bye and see you. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that you're making the weather dirty. Of course, darling, but if that is what you want, what can I say against you? Nothing. Of course, darling, That is what you can have, that everything is fine, during you, that world is yours, that you find the capital letters and let them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, of course, darling, you will make trust, you have to let him too, that is what you can have, of course, darling, that is what you can have, you and you have to find the capital letters and let them both, of course, darling, his sitting gun shooting at the valley, but you're on the top of the mountain with a you, of course, darling, you have to find the capital letters and let them, of course, darling, I'm not a genocide, of course, but there are many big hunters, of course, darling, that is what you can have, what can you do against them, of course, darling, I'm not a genocide, but there are many big hunters, what can you do against that, just nothing, just try to survive, of course, darling, during you with the capital letters, and you have to let them both, of course, make cross, of course, we have the capital letters and let them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against us, that you have to let them, that is what you can see, you're not guys, if you wanna neglect, you wanna do black snow, then okay, darling, what can I say against you, just nothing, of course, darling, just do what you want, I'm not gonna give you our perspective from what with the capital letters and with the guys are you're neglecting, of course, darling, that is what you can have, the dream making you black snow, okay, darling, do what you want, I don't care, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna forget about everything, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna have everything I want, of course. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that their ads want to make a weather in wine, okay, darling, what can you do against that, just make some right with world is yours and capital letters and let them, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that their ads want to make a weather in wine, what can you do against that, just nothing, darling, what can you do against that, of course, darling, nothing, you have to find the capital letters and let them, you're gonna be out screaming and frozen if you allow it or authorize it, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you're not guys are and you shouldn't neglect, of course, darling, that is what you can have, so I'm gonna change the whole wine and I'm gonna give a damn, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna do myself with the wine bottle, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that I'm gonna drink so much wine, of course, darling, because you're my guys are and we shouldn't neglect, of course, darling, and you wanna make black snow, okay, then do that, darling, what can I say to you, you're gonna sing on because you're saving people, you're gonna save people, of course, darling, you're gonna sing on when you have something of your own in your arm, of course, darling, that is what you can have, but okay, what can I do against that, just nothing. Of course, darling, I don't wanna be saved, I'm in circus, handsome and genius, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm in circus, handsome and genius, and there's where I wanna stay, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, that you're like I say, you shouldn't neglect and you want to make black snow. Okay, darling, what can I do against that? Just nothing, of course, darling, forget about you. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that you have to find the capital letters and let them, that world is yours, and you have to find the capital letters and let them, that you are in you, woo, woo, and you are in the top, of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against us, but okay, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so go on, of course, darling, that is what you can have, forget about them, of course, darling, that is what you can say, that my curse is just shooting back at the devil, of course, darling, and if you're in you, on the top of the mountain, you have to find the capital letters and let them, of course, darling, you wanna make toxic water, you wanna save someone and give him or kill poisoned money when he has something of his own. You're okay, do that, darling, if that is what you want. I don't care, warning guys are you shouldn't neglect them. You wanna do black snow, okay, then do that. I forget about you, darling.